Arizona is out of short-term drought for the first time in nearly a decade. That's according to the U.S. Drought Monitor. It's a big change from last year when the entire state was experiencing drought conditions. This Arizona's Horizon segment is part of Elemental Covering Sustainability, a multimedia collaboration between public television and radio stations in Arizona, California, and Colorado. Joining us now is Einav Henenson from the State Department of Water Resources. Welcome to Arizona Horizon.
Thanks for having me.
Good to have you. First, what is the U.S. Drought Monitor?
So the U.S. Drought Monitor was developed about 20 years ago to create some sort of a catch-all drought map to reflect drought conditions across the country. So it provides information to all the different states about drought conditions, both short and long-term drought for certain areas. But you probably know that short-term conditions may be different than long-term conditions, especially if you look at east and west.
So let's talk about drought. What is it? Define a drought for us.
So drought is a prolonged period of lower than average precipitation that is severe enough to affect, to negatively impact both the environment and human activities. So some of these activities could be forest health or recreation, also other environmental impacts such as our reservoirs and water supply, wildfires, so increase in the number and magnitude of the wildfires, impact to our wildlife populations.
Okay, we have a map here now of the Drought Monitor's map of short-term drought in Arizona, and that little yellow thing up there by the four corners, that's the only area of concern right now?
Yes, and even though it's some sort of area of concern, it's considered abnormally dry, not even drought, but just to mention, the U.S. Drought Monitor reflects drought conditions across the country. In Arizona specifically, we look at drought conditions in time scales that are 2, 3, and 4 years. In other areas, especially in the east side of the country, they measure drought in time scales of 12 months and less. So
interesting.
It's very different to the way we look at drought.
Okay, well, with that in mind, we also have a map, and let's keep this up for a little while here. This is of the long-term drought. Now, that looks like a little more familiar here.
Exactly, so the U.S. Drought Monitor map is a great tool to look at short-term drought conditions, but as I mentioned, there is this discrepancy in the West that we look at much greater timescales for drought, so the State Drought Monitoring Technical Committee is creating our own long-term drought conditions for the state every quarter, and this is what we're looking at, and that gives us a much better picture of how drought looks in Arizona.
When we look at this Colorado River area, obviously problem there, Four Corners area, problem there. It looks like most of the high country, not so bad.
Not so bad, and again, we had a relatively wet winter, and it does have some impact on the long term. However, in order for us to get out of the long-term drought that we've experienced since the mid-90s, actually, we really need 3 consecutive wet winter. One winter is a great start, but it's not enough to get us out of the long-term drought.
I was going to say, because you see that short-term map, and one winter, that's all it takes to get out of that. But you really need 2, and you really need 3. Is it possible, do you think?
I hope so.
Yeah.
We had 1, so I really hope we will get wetter in the next 2 years here.
So the bottom line is, forget the bottom line. I want to get back to how drought is being measured. Again, the definition of drought, and again, I mean, is it literally rainfall? Is it the effect on certain agriculture, climate, landscape? What?
So that's a great question, and there's about over 100 definitions of drought. It depends on what you're looking for and who you are. So there is agricultural drought, there is socioeconomic, hydrologic drought. But when we look at drought, what we look at is evaporation, precipitation patterns, and a lot of scientific data to measure our conditions, our moisture conditions, but we also look at more of the subjective data, and we talk with people that have on-the-ground experience, if it's farmers, if it's ranchers, if it's other field service agents that see how the soil moisture look like, how vegetation look like. So we try to combine both objective and subjective data to assess how drought impact the state.
So you could have a relatively wet winter, wet summer, this sort of thing, and still be in a drought because the effects on the land and on certain segments of the land and the population aren't as strong as one would expect.
Correct. And again, we've been in a long-term drought since the mid-90s, and that doesn't mean that necessarily all of these years have been dry. We did have some really good wet years. However, they were few compared to the amount or to the number of drier than average years that we had through this process. So it really depends on where you are in the state, but we really need more than one storm or one wet winter to really hydrate all the deficits that we have in the past 20, 25 years.
All right, well, encouraging news. Einav Henenson, Arizona Department of Water Resources, good to have you here.
Thanks for having me,
Thank
Ted.
you.